Good afternoon and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. This month our topic is cybersecurity. I know this is an issue that's been at the forefront of several folks' minds. We're going to talk about what's required, what is best practice, some action steps, and just hopefully get you a little bit better understanding of what cybersecurity needs to look like in the RIA space. Before we do that, however, we obviously have some disclosures, and we'll go through these fairly quickly. RIA in a box and my RIA compliance are not law firms, CPA firms, or registered investment advisory firms. None of the information presented here, advice given, services rendered should be considered legal, tax, accounting, or investment advice. And if you require the services of an attorney, we recommend that you seek out an independent attorney to verify their securities law experience and engage them for that legal advice. If you have questions throughout the webinar, you can find a questions button on the GoToWebinar dashboard on your screen, and we will get those questions answered for you as best we can and as quickly as we can. If they come in at the very end of the presentation, we may need to follow up with you after the fact. On the webinar today, you'll see our participants here: Chad Hartwig, Hovig Melkonian, Colleen Keefe, David Crowther, and I'm your host, Jason Vincent Haler. And again, this month, we are going to be going over, again, cybersecurity, but we'll talk about the regulation and standards with that. There are some SEC regulations that apply here. The SEC also released some observations. We'll talk a little bit about the National Institute for Security for Standards and Technology, ISO, the IEC, and then state statutes. We'll also discuss what the threats are and how to conduct some risk assessment on your firm. And then also we'll talk about some action steps and best practices for the firm to undertake. We'll start out with the SEC regulations as they currently apply. You may have seen on the topics page about SEC Reg SP and Reg SID. I'm going to focus on Reg SP here because that really is the cornerstone of the regulatory landscape right now for cybersecurity. It has to do with privacy, and SID has to do with identity theft. And essentially what Reg SP sets out is that in your procedures, they need to be reasonably designed to ensure the security and confidentiality of customer records. They need to protect against potential anticipated threats or hazards, protect against unauthorized access, that sort of thing. And just a quick side note, I'm going to be covering this information fairly quickly. There's a good bit of information here to get through, and I want to make sure that we're able to cover all of that ground as best we can. Keep in mind, we do record these webinars, and they are available on my RIA compliance, usually a couple days after we're live here on the third Wednesday of the month. So if you miss something, there are a large amount of text on each of these slides, so if you miss something, definitely go back, watch the webinar again, hit pause, take some notes as needed, and then also reach out to your compliance experts here, and we can help you out as well. Some best practices related to Reg SP. I know we talked a little bit about what the procedures are designed to reasonably do, and with these best practices, they were proposed amendments to Reg SP back in 2008. They were not implemented, but it's a good guideline as far as best practices for the firm to start out as kind of a beginning point to your cybersecurity program within the firm. You need to be able to identify risk to personal information and technology systems. So that goes back to that risk assessment that we'll talk about a little bit later in the broadcast. You need to implement controls against those risks. So once you've identified the risks, what are you going to do about those? You need to test the effectiveness of your controls, and that needs to happen on a regular basis. This isn't a static environment. It's a very dynamic environment. The threats are always evolving. You need to understand how you're going to respond to unauthorized access how you're going to investigate that, what's the nature and scope of that incursion. And then you need to have a plan in place as to how you're going to notify the individuals affected by any kind of breach that may happen. We'll move on from Reg SP into a little bit, into a little bit deeper information that was provided here recently by the SEC. They released a document called Observations from Cybersecurity Examinations, and it was a very broad document that covered a lot of different areas. They dealt with broker-dealers and investment advisors on these, and they included information there. But one key quote that really jumped out at me on this was that they said cybersecurity remains one of the top compliance risks for financial firms. Now, it's interesting because the SEC does not have a specific cybersecurity rule in place. Obviously, Reg SP and Reg SID play into that, but there's not a specific cybersecurity rule from them. So where they're coming from on this remaining a top compliance risk is kind of goes back to that, what are your procedures? What do your firm's procedures say? How are you handling these risks? What are you doing to identify risks and then mitigate those risks and then address problems as they come up? So a couple of things I want to focus on here. One is the issues that the Commission observed and noted in their document, and then we'll talk a little bit too about what they consider a robust policies and procedures manual. So as far as issues that they noted, not surprisingly, the top one on the list here was policies and procedures were not reasonably tailored and provide only general guidance. And if you look at the document, they go into just a bit more detail on this. But essentially, what we mean is, and you'll hear myself and my colleagues on the compliance team discuss this with you over and over and over, and it probably, you get tired of hearing it at some point, but your policies and procedures need to be tailored to your firm. They need to reflect what you're actually doing on the ground and what risks are actually in place for your firm. That being said, when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to understand what your risk profile looks like. Do you have multiple workstation computers, laptops that are coming in and out of the firm? Do you have Wi-Fi for your firm, or is it all hardline? Do you have folks using their mobile devices to access client information? You know, all of those details and more, frankly, play into creating policies and procedures for cybersecurity that are tailored to the firm. The other piece of that is they want you to provide specific guidance, and we'll get into a little bit of that later in your procedures, but just understand that vague generalities aren't going to cut it with the SEC, especially I have a feeling at some point we'll see a rule specific to cybersecurity come down from the SEC. Like I said, we don't have one yet, but where they're already talking about kind of what they want to see and some issues that they've observed, I would say that's on the horizon. They also noted that firms did not appear to adhere to or enforce policies and procedures, or the procedures didn't reflect the firm's actual practices. Again, kind of a different way of saying the same thing. Make sure that your procedures are tailored to your firm and then actually follow those procedures. They noted that firms didn't appear to adequately conduct system maintenance, things like software patches, operational safeguards, virus scans. All of that would be considered system maintenance. And so you have to make sure that your systems are up to date. Another really big issue that we're seeing is if you're using outdated systems and software and operating systems, and you'll see that later on the list here as well, that aren't supported by those security patches. If you're still using Internet Explorer, please don't. They've stopped putting out the security patches for that. Windows Vista, I believe it was, is the latest one that's fallen off. We made it a little bit beyond that even. But they're not providing security patches for that. If that's the case with your system, please update it so that you can get those security patches. Another issue they noted was stale risk assessments. As I note here, we have a tool for that will help you with your risk assessment. You need to keep those risk assessments up to date. Do those annually, just as part of your compliance program overview. You really should be looking at the compliance risks of the firm on an overall basis, but specifically what kind of cybersecurity risk do you face? Make sure that you stay on top of that because it is that dynamic environment. And then finally, they noted lack of remediation efforts. Basically if you find a problem, fix it. If you notice that you have a vulnerability, maybe your passwords aren't being updated properly, something of that nature, you need to take steps to mitigate that problem, mitigate that risk. Moving on to the elements of a robust policies and procedures, the SEC actually gives us a little glimpse of what they're looking for here. And first on the list is maintain an inventory of data, information, and vendors. So keep an inventory. What types of systems do you have? What devices are going to be accessing those systems? Have an understanding of what kind of data you're maintaining. What vendors have access to that data? And stay on top of that. Keep it current, keep it up to date. The procedures also should have detailed cybersecurity related instructions. Penetration tests. How are you going to do them? How often? What systems are you going to attempt to penetrate? What data are you going to attempt to get? Security monitoring and system auditing. Basically, how are you going to know if someone accesses data that they're not authorized to access? And keep in mind, a big cybersecurity risk is internal, not external. The biggest risk is actually internal. That is things like locking your computers when you walk away from them. Not writing all of your passwords on a piece of notebook paper and keeping it in your top desk drawer. We've all done it, but please don't. The cybersecurity instructions need to detail who has access rights to data. And then obviously reporting, how are you going to report what you've found? You also need to maintain prescriptive schedules and processes for testing data integrity and vulnerability. This goes back to those penetration tests, vulnerability scans, patch management. How are you going to know when there's a new patch out there that needs to be installed, and how do you ensure that that actually happens when that patch is released? One of the suggestions they had was that you attempt to do a beta test of the patch. Then you also need to establish and enforce controls on access and systems. So you have a detailed acceptable use policy, restrict mobile devices. If maybe somebody's going to have their mobile device and access firm data from that mobile device, that's fine, but you need to have a policy in place on how they're going to do that and what kind of control they need to have on that mobile device. I think we've all had a situation where we've set our phone down and walked away from it for a moment and then forgot where we set it. That happens from time to time. Or, a phone has gotten to be anyway a more expensive piece of technology that you're carrying around that is very portable and very easy to, someone acting in nefarious purposes to grab that and put it in a pocket and walk away. So make sure that you have the proper security on those devices that are going to be used outside of the firm office. You need to have logs from your third-party vendors of their activity on the firm network. So if you have an IT contractor that comes in and does system maintenance, make sure they're giving you a log of what they do, when they do it, and why they've done it. And then when you have a terminated employee or someone that voluntarily resigns, you need to terminate their access. If it's a situation where the employee is being terminated and it's not a voluntary termination, you need to terminate that access immediately. If it's a situation where the employee gives you notice, then at that point you have a little bit more flexibility of what kind of access you allow them, but you still need to have a policy and stay on top of that. And then you also need to do mandatory employment training. You train them up at onboarding and then periodically thereafter. It's a good topic to include in some of your annual compliance meetings. Just make sure that everyone's up to speed on what the latest risk is, what you're doing for that, any changes to the acceptable use policy, anything like that. And then you also need to have an engaged senior management. Without senior management buy-in, this really is just an exercise in futility, because if the senior management doesn't participate actively in this, it's going to trickle down through the rest of the organization, and everyone else is going to see that Again, there's a lot more information covered on that SEC release, but those are the high points that you can actually take some action steps right now and put into use. I'm also going to talk about here just a little bit the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST. They have a list of absolutely necessary actions that they believe should be taken to maintain the integrity of your cybersecurity system. Obviously keep regular updated antivirus, anti-spyware, anti-malware software. Use a firewall between the internal network and the internet, ensuring operating systems and apps are up to date, back up important data. A side note on backing up data, make sure that you know where you're backing that up to. If it's a cloud service, make sure you do your due diligence on that cloud service and understand what controls they have in place to protect your data, because that is another access point that if someone wants to get at that data, that's an access point when you're transmitting that information. Again, train employees and supervise persons on basic security protocol. When the regulator comes in and asks you to show them, how you place trades, don't just set them in front of your computer and hand them your list of passwords and let them go to town. That's not good security practices. And so make sure that you stay on top of that. Make sure that your employees understand what's required. And then they say you need to require strong passwords for each user in the system. Obviously, don't share passwords. Don't have one firm-wide password and the user login for systems. Kind of defeats the point of having those. And then limit employee access to data and admin rights. Compartmentalize. This is kind of a need-to-know basis, and if someone doesn't need access to that information, don't allow it. They also, in the NIST framework, talk about Wi-Fi protected access, encryption, or WPA-2. There's been a lot of information in the news lately that maybe that's not quite as secure as everyone had thought it was. So make sure you stay on top of that. Any patches that come out for that, make sure those get updated as well. The ISO and IEC standards, they focus on information security management requirements, and then some codes of practice for information security. They both include the people, processes, and systems that apply to mitigating risk in this situation. I know the NASA Cybersecurity and Technology Project Group used the ISO and IEC standards as a reference when they developed exam modules. They also use that NIST framework to help them develop those. So that's a good starting point. It also appears that some of that information was used in the SEC's release, talking about their observations from the cybersecurity examinations. And so that's a good segue here into the state statutes and what those look like, to talk a little bit about the North American Securities Administrators Association, what they've done for cybersecurity and technology. And recently they released a cybersecurity checklist for investment advisors. I was actually on this project group that kind of began this process several years ago in looking at what cybersecurity looked like for our RIA firms. And, looking at the question, how do we examine this? Do we need to write a rule, a specific rule for cybersecurity? And that was kind of the end goal. But we also wrote some examination modules to gauge what firms were doing, gauge what the risk looked like, and just gather information ahead of any type of rulemaking. And the cybersecurity checklist that was released, I can't say that it's exactly the same as the examination modules, but it is very, very close. If you've looked at the examination modules, it's going to look very, very similar to that. And it looks like we may be having some audio challenges here as well. So hopefully you can all still hear me. Anyway, the checklist is a good guide. It's 7 pages long, so it's fairly lengthy and covers a lot of ground. on the cybersecurity world as it pertains to investment advisors. But it's good to use that. You can use that as a risk assessment and have a general idea of what your firm looks like from a cybersecurity perspective. Also, here this year, in July of this year, Colorado actually implemented a specific cybersecurity rule for investment advisors. That rule, which you'll see here in just a moment, and again, I apologize, we're having a bit of technical difficulty getting the slide view to upload. But under the cybersecurity rule in Colorado, you're required to establish and maintain written procedures, quote, reasonably designed to ensure cybersecurity, end quote. And those must provide for, at least as reasonably as possible, an annual assessment of the potential risks and vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of confidential personal information, the use of secure email for email containing confidential personal information. So if you're sending an email to a client and it has any of those non-public information, some of those non-public identifiers in there, that email needs to be secure. And there are several different services that allow you to send an encrypted email, or if you're dealing with digital signatures, you need to use a secure email for that as well. I know several firms are starting to use things like DocuSign and other methods such as that to handle that. To handle their contracts and such. You also need to have authentication practices for employee access to electronic communications, databases, and media. That means that you need to be able to make sure that the people that are supposed to have access to it do in fact have access to that information. You also need to have procedures for authenticating client instructions received via electronic communications. Most firms, to address that, they say that they don't accept instructions via email. You need to be able to verify that. That could be a follow-up phone call to a known phone number, several different methods that you can use there. And then you need to disclose to clients the risks of using electronic communication. And then you also need to include cybersecurity as part of your annual risk assessment. So again, this tracks very closely with what we've already talked about. You need to conduct risk assessments on your cybersecurity. Make sure that you're maintaining your systems in a way that you address those potential risks, and those risk assessments are staying up to date. Make sure that the folks that are supposed to have access, and those that don't. And then again, they go kind of a step farther in requiring that secure email, which frankly that's a best practice anyway. You really should be using secure email if you are sharing non-public information via email, or you're emailing that non-public information to clients. Another thing that a lot of firms have started doing is using a portal to where they can send an email and say, your statement's available in your portal, or we've provided your information, log into your portal to retrieve it. That's another method to basically authenticate who that client is and who has access to that information for the client. Another state that also has just recently put out regulation on cybersecurity, made a specific rule. This went into effect in May of this year, May 1st, is the state of Vermont. They address, rather than saying investment advisors and broker-dealers specifically, they say securities professionals. And they define a securities professional as any person providing investment-related services in Vermont, including broker-dealers, agents, investment advisors, investment advisor representatives, solicitors, and third-party portals. So basically, if you are in the security space, and if you're listening to this webinar, you are considered a securities professional. Theirs is going to look very similar to Colorado's. Their wording is a little bit different, but they require that you have procedures in place to reasonably ensure cybersecurity, and you have to protect. It needs to be focused on the protection of investor and firm information from compromise. And so with that, they require you to have an annual cybersecurity risk assessment. use of secure email, including use of encryption. We'll talk a little bit about encryption later because there are some points that I want to bring up about encryption. Authentication practices, procedures for authenticating client instructions, disclosure of risks again, and then they again reiterate that you need to include cybersecurity as part of your risk assessment. You need to maintain evidence of adequate insurance for the risk of cybersecurity breach, and this is where they start to really differ from Colorado. Colorado is not requiring cybersecurity insurance, whereas Vermont is. There are a handful of firms out there that offer this type of insurance, so if you're doing business in Vermont, you really need to look into that because it is something that is required of their firms, and they don't define what is adequate. You need to work with your insurer and based on risk assessment, to help you determine what's adequate there. And then they also require that you provide identity restoration services at no cost to customers. So that is, for example, the latest giant security breach, Equifax. You can sign up for monitoring and that sort of thing. It's similar here. They don't really define what those restoration services need to look like, but that's where they're going with that. Again, those two states so far are the only ones that have put out a specific cybersecurity rule. In the other states, you look more at state privacy statutes, data breach notification laws, that sort of thing. Those exist in 47 states. They include, and then they also include D.C., Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands. They vary greatly by jurisdiction. For example, Massachusetts has a very detailed law that requires computer security with user authentication protocols, access control measures, encryption of all data transmitted wirelessly, encryption of personal information stored on laptops and other portable devices, up-to-date firewall, malware protection, and also employee training. So again, that's one of the more detailed laws, and you can point to that and say, well, that's a cybersecurity law. It's not a specific RIA cybersecurity rule like we're seeing in Colorado and in Vermont. It's just something to keep in mind there. And then also, there's a website here that is the National Conference of State Legislatures. You can take a look at data breach notification laws there and get a little bit more information. And if you don't have time to write that down, remember we record this webinar so you can come back and write that down later. We're going to move on a little bit to cybersecurity threats and risk assessments and what those need to look like. And essentially, that a good risk assessment is really a strong part of upholding that fiduciary duty to clients, maintaining sound practices. What you're trying to do there is ensure that the firm's system is adequate by definition of your unique risks to the firm itself and also to the client. You really should do these on at least an annual basis because, again, the cybersecurity threat is ever-changing. It's ever-evolving. Once one thing kind of gets tamped down, another one pops up. It's kind of like whack-a-mole in that way. You hit one on the head and it comes up somewhere else that there's another area of vulnerability. So you're always going to be chasing this to some degree, but the key here is understanding what the risk looks like and helping you determine that level of cybersecurity insurance that you need or that you may want to have, and also understanding what the risk to the firm is, what the risk to the client is, and being able to articulate that to the regulator and saying that, yes, we understand that these are our risks. Here's what we're doing to mitigate those risks. The cybersecurity risk assessment should be part of kind of that overarching risk assessment for the firm. So you do your annual internal compliance review. When you're doing that and when you're doing your risk assessment from a compliance risk perspective, you need to also look at your cybersecurity risk as part of that because that is a risk to the firm. It's a risk to client. You need to determine as a firm how often you want to conduct the cybersecurity risk assessment, and then stick with it. It can be quarterly, it can be annually, it can be continually. You can have a system that's monitored all the time. It really depends on what your firm looks like, what type of information and what type of risk you have. And so you really need to hone in on that and figure out what the risk profile of your firm looks like. And again, you can use the tools on MyRA Compliance. We have a risk assessment tool for our professional level clients. You can also use the Cybersecurity checklist for investment advisors that the North American Securities Administrators Association put out. We actually have a blog post on that just went live yesterday, and you can link to that from your MyRA Compliance homepage. Some things that you need to do, though, are examine the data collected and created. What is it? Where is it stored? Do you encrypt it? You need to look at that insider risk, that internal risk. The first thing people think of when they think of insider risk is they think of a disgruntled employee or a rogue employee, but it's more than just that. It can be carelessness. It can be someone who, goes to the break room, goes to grab a cup of coffee and leaves their system unlocked and accessible to just anyone. Those types of risks need to be addressed as well. Your risk assessment also needs to include your relationships with those third parties and doing that solid due diligence on your vendors that have access to non-public information. And then finally, you need to look at your policies and procedures and determine whether or not they are well-tailored, whether they're robust policies and procedures as the SEC defined it. Those come down to several factors, but a couple of key points here is how often do you require password changes, locking of devices, reporting lost or stolen devices. All that information is going to factor in there. As far as what the risks look like, we've talked a little bit about internal risks. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a bit. But I wanted to go into what some of the risks look like, both external and internal. So external threats and risks, there's a couple of different types of incursions. There's the backdoor incursion, which is a breach to a cloud software provider. So say you're using Dropbox or iCloud or Microsoft OneDrive or whoever you use, and say they have a breach. So that's a backdoor breach, but it still impacts or potentially impacts your user data, because if a hacker can breach a cloud provider, they have a wealth of knowledge that they have now gained access to, and it may take a good bit of time before you realize that there's even been an incursion there. And then you have your front door incursions, which is someone logs in as a user. Maybe they've got a keylogger or something like that that grabs that access information, that login credential. They log in and they have access to your internal systems. The cloud provider is not going to register that as a breach because it looks like someone who's authorized to have access has gained access. You see these with email phishing scams and things of that nature. And if you provide Wi-Fi services to your clients or to individuals who come into your offices, please make sure that you have a router with a separate guest setting that allows limited access so that you can kind of put up that wall and keep some separation so that you don't have someone just logged into your Wi-Fi system and able to gain access to your data that way. Some other external threats, external risks, the theft of devices. Like I mentioned earlier, we all have cell phones. They're pretty easy targets, kind of that low-hanging fruit for people that don't really care about doing the right thing. They want to steal your device, especially if you have the latest iPhone that costs $1,000. Well, they can pocket that and then sell that later for however much, and it's basically zero cost of goods sold to them, so it's 100% profit, so they don't care if they sell it and somebody else thinks they get a good deal. Well, then all of a sudden they have access to all of your data if you don't have that properly secured and properly handled on those devices, and they're definitely a target of opportunity. But if you have someone that knows what you do, knows the level of access you have to several client personal identification information, that you would be a prime target for someone trying to gather a large amount of data relatively easily by walking off of one of your devices. And then you have the other theft of, so you have data and identity theft. These usually involve some kind of spyware incursion, virus incursion, unsecured Wi-Fi, physical access to a connected device. That's where you don't lock your computer when you walk away. And then another one that I added here is Google searches of online data storage. Google Drive is a good example of this. For the most part, Google does not map its own Google Drives unless you've shared it in a few specific ways. And if someone knows the right keyword search terms to put in there, you can pull up somebody's Google Sheets with all their passwords. You can pull up all kinds of information off of there. So just be mindful of the things that you save in that online data storage, and be mindful of how that is secured. We'll move on here to internal risks, internal threats, and this is probably a greater risk to cybersecurity, probably a more common because you're not looking for it as often. You have the untrained or the careless employee, so they lose their device, they leave their stuff unlocked. They don't check the credentials of an outside personnel. If a regulator comes to do an audit of the firm, please check their ID. They're not going to mind. It's expected that you do that because you don't want just anyone walking in and having access to your information. Another issue is thumb drives and other devices. They can contain viruses, spyware. They can load automatically when you plug it in. This happens from time to time with quote-unquote found thumb drives. If someone wants to gain access to your network, they can place that virus on a thumb drive, drop it in the parking lot, somebody picks it up, plugs it in, and there you go, they have access now because of this virus. Attachments on emails, that's like the phishing scams, we see those from time to time. If you go to unauthorized websites, there again, having good procedures in place and acceptable use policies in place are critical here. And then maybe oversharing on social media is another concern that goes along with that internal risk. Some other internal risks that we see is, and this is more what folks think of when they think of an internal risk or an internal cybersecurity threat, and that's that disgruntled or malicious employee. They intend to harm the business, so they intend to harm specific clients. It can come up as a theft of data for profit. It's very lucrative in the illicit data trade, and it's incredibly hard to track. There may be some corporate espionage. You would like to think that wouldn't happen, but businesses like to know what other businesses, their competition is doing. So you could see some of that. And you see this show up when an employee is accessing data that they have no need or right to access. They may download client data on external storage without the need or authorization there. So again, having good solid policies and procedures in place and good controls in place are going to help you mitigate those risks. Up next, we'll jump to some action steps and best practices. Basically, you need to create your policies and procedures related to cybersecurity to be tailored to your firm. You need to secure or limit access to devices or computers. Have a policy on how you're connected. If you're going to use public Wi-Fi, please don't. Use a VPN instead. Those sorts of things are going to help you protect the integrity of your network and protect the integrity of the data that you're accessing. Maintain your hardware and your software. Make the updates as needed. Upgrade with security patches. Do all that kind of thing. Make sure that your software is still supported by the developer. If it's not supported by the developer, find new software. Upgrade that software. And then, have a policy in place on how you're going to monitor for attempts to access that data by unauthorized individuals. So how are you going to monitor that? What is your response going to be? What's your response going to be to loss or theft of devices or storage mediums? How are you going to continue operation if there's a cybersecurity event? And this kind of goes a little bit into the business continuity planning too, where your cybersecurity policies can really have tentacles out into the rest of the procedures of the firm, because everyone's online. All of our data is out there. So you need to be able to have that procedure in place on how you're going to address that. You need to oversee third-party IT providers. Do your due diligence. Understand what kind of due diligence they do on the folks that they have risk insurance in place for cybersecurity. And then again, conduct those risk assessments. Look at it from an adversarial point of view. So look at it like you're going to try to hack your own system. Look at it like you're going to try to steal your own data, and that will help you identify where those threats may come from, what the vulnerabilities may be, and then you have to look at the consequences. What are the consequences of losing that data? To take it a step further, your procedure should contain some sort of data breach response plan. And on this next slide, I have the information from the Department of Justice. So your response plan needs to cover things like who has lead responsibility for the different elements of the organization's incident response. So, who's going to contact critical personnel? How are they to be contacted? How do you proceed if critical personnel aren't reachable? What kind of mission critical data do you have? What needs the greatest protection? How do you preserve data related to the intrusion? There are some ways to do forensic examinations of computer hardware and software. That goes beyond the capabilities of most firms, but law enforcement agencies may want to see this. If this is a major breach, they have technicians on staff that can review this information. So how are you going to protect it? How are you going to maintain, kind of those fingerprints, if you will? Where in this case it's not physical fingerprints, but it's digital. How do you maintain the integrity of that so that if there's a chance of catching the data thief, that you'd be able to do that? And then kind of trailing along with that, you need to have procedures for when and how to notify law enforcement. How to notify your cybersecurity insurance provider as well as something to consider here. And then some more action steps and best practices here. I had mentioned earlier that we would talk a little bit more in depth about data encryption. And this next slide talks about encryption just a little bit in some fairly broad terms. But some things to keep in mind about encryption. It's not the end-all be-all. Just because data is encrypted doesn't mean that it's safe necessarily. You need to have procedures in place for your encryption. You need to categorize it, whether it's confidential or not confidential. If it's not confidential, you really need to encrypt it. And you need to differentiate between the data that's at rest, in transit, and in use. And the reason that you do that is because you want to encrypt it to the minimum necessary level. The issue here is if you encrypt absolutely everything, every piece of data, anytime you want to do something with any of your data, you have to unencrypt it to be able to work on it, and then you re-encrypt it. Well, every time that you unencrypt your data, that allows an entry point. And so that allows kind of that toehold, that foothold for someone trying to gain access to your data. You also need to consider the safeguards that are in place at the destination for that data that's in transit. Again, there's the two rules in Colorado and Vermont recommend encrypted email, and they recommend secure email. That's great as long as you know that it's going to be secure on the other end. I mean, basically what they're saying is you're taking the steps that you need to take to protect that data, but you don't know what steps are being taken on the other end to protect that data. And this comes more into play with your vendors, that maybe you're transmitting data to a third-party money manager. You should have that information in place, that due diligence in place on what sorts of safeguards they have, because encryption is only as safe as the protocols on either end of that encryption, especially when it's in transit. You also need to determine how user IDs and credentials is going to be managed for anyone who has access to that data, that non-public personal information of clients. Again, passwords need to be updated regularly. You need to compartmentalize the data, make sure that only the people that need to have the access to that information actually have access on the ground. And those are the sorts of things that you need to consider as part of your procedures, and you also need to consider that when you're looking at encryption providers. There are a handful of different ways to encrypt data there, and so you need to look at that. When it comes to email, on the next slide here, you need to have a clear procedure in place for how you're using email. What's acceptable to transmit via email, what's not. You need to train up your personnel, and again, a lot of this comes back to training. Make sure that you're mitigating that risk of internal data breach by making sure that your employees are properly trained, or your access persons, your supervised persons are properly trained, and maintain that training as well. If things change, make sure that you train them up on the changes. What's new, what's different, and that's going to help you mitigate that risk. And again, here you'll see mentioned too, they use only secure email to transmit client MPI. That's a best practice. It's statutorily required now in a couple of states. Don't ever send client logins, credentials, or passwords via unsecure information, and make sure that clients know that just standard email is not secure. Most people treat email like they do regular postal mail, where you put it in an envelope and you seal it up and you send it, and you can usually sort of tell if that envelope has been opened. That's not the case with email. You're basically kind of aiming that broadcast to the specific spot, that there are ways that cyber criminals can intercept that email, and they can also impersonate clients via email. So that's where it comes in, to make sure that you have a good process in place to authenticate instructions from clients that come in. So if your client emails you and says, hey, wire me $100,000, you need to be able to verify who that person is, and verify that that is in fact what they want to do. And just ensure that you have that process in place and that it is always followed. Up next, we'll talk about vendors and cloud services and kind of some of the things to do there. We've talked a lot about due diligence of vendors. Obviously, you need to pay particular attention when they're storing non-public information for your clients. You need to understand what their safeguards are, what they've done. Understand how they'll respond to a data breach. You need to ask if the firm data is segregated from other data. What level of access do the firm employees have at those vendors? You need to have a policy on remote access, so that cloud services. It's going to govern access via mobile devices, and help ensure that you maintain the integrity of your cloud storage. You also need to, I would highly encourage at least, that you use VPN for remote access. VPN is a virtual private network. It basically creates a tunnel from the device into your network on the other end of that VPN. And when you use that, it makes it far more difficult for someone to gain access. This is particularly important when you're using public Wi-Fi hotspots and things of that nature. It's going to help prevent some of those incursions. It's not foolproof. It's not the end-all be-all of data security for remote access. You still need to use good practices, but it's a starting point. And I would definitely encourage that. And then keep in mind, especially when you're dealing with VPN, if the service is free, find out where the revenue comes from. Are they selling access lists? Are they using your IP as a location on their VPN? What are they doing? Why is it free? Have an understanding there. With VPNs, you kind of get what you pay for, basically, and so you need to make sure that you have an understanding of that and what it looks like. When it comes to your firm website, a lot of websites have access portals for clients to log in, either to like an e-money, or log into the custodian's portal. Understand what that looks like. Make sure that you have good credentials, that you require strong passwords of your clients to help them protect their data. You may offer just a link to the custodian website or a third-party service provider like an Orion. That's another option. That way, you just link to them and they have to put in their credentials on their own. You don't have to worry about transferring that credential from your site to another site. You should also have a confidentiality agreement in place with any third-party developers. you would hope that they would be ethical, but at least a confidentiality agreement is going to put in writing that they're going to be ethical and that they're going to treat your data with the proper the proper security. Again, we talk a little bit about encryption. It's not the end-all be-all, but it helps. And so make sure that you're encrypting data where it needs to be encrypted through the portal. You'll also see that firm websites can be vulnerable to broken authentication exploitation, which is when there's insufficient encryption or password security safeguards, and it allows an unauthorized user to gain access so that they can log in as an admin to your website and really create some havoc, because then if you have portals for clients to log into, that's a very quick way for them to gather a bunch of information from your clients, and your clients think that they're providing that information to you to be able to log into their portal. So keep those in mind when you put that together, and make sure that your developer of your website has a good understanding of how to prevent that sort of problem going forward. On the next slide, we'll talk about the anti-malware. And when I say malware, I mean viruses, spyware, keyloggers, you've heard them called Trojan horses, worms, basically any software that's going to attach itself to your software and cause problems. This is why regular updates to your system are critical. Make sure that security patches are put in place. That developers on both sides of the law are always working to prevent the next attack and to perpetrate the next attack. So make sure that you keep your systems up to date. Make sure that you're doing scans of your system regularly. Have a good anti-malware software in place to help prevent that. This is also where kind of firewalls and things of that nature come into play. You need to scan any outside media that's going to be attached to computers. We talked earlier about the person that found a thumb drive, plugged it into the computer, and it automatically loaded a virus. So make sure that you have processes and systems in place to scan anything that gets attached to the device, and then isolate that. Always scan email attachment before opening them, and then make sure that you're managing your user ID and credentials again. A lot of the best practices also center around monitoring and being able to determine what to monitor. How do you monitor? How do you determine if you've had a breach? And so here's some things that will give you some tools to use to help monitor. Some of these are a little more low-tech than others. There are vendors out there that will offer this service, that provide this service for you. There are software systems that will do it, or you can, depending on the size of your firm, you can conduct some of these yourself. You need to monitor for things like logging into the system after hours. Is it going to catch that login? If there's a non-local region, so if you don't have someone traveling to southern Russia and you all of a sudden have a login to your system from southern Russia, you need to be able to document that and you need to determine that happened and how it happened and if they were able to log in or not. If there's large transfers of file or data, you need to know about that. Someone that has multiple login attempts. I know I've done this. I've forgotten my passwords, so I'll try the last 15 passwords that I can remember, and then I get the notification that says, I'm sorry, you're locked out. That is that multiple login attempt. It's preventing someone from trying to guess the password or trying to guess the login credentials when they don't actually have it and they're not actually the person authorized to see the information that login would provide. And then if there's unknown devices, you also need to monitor for that. And then again, document the incidents. Just like any time that you see a violation of your policies and procedures, treat this the same way. You want to document the incident as well as what you did in response to that incident. And this also leads into testing a little bit. You have to test guard your cybersecurity policy, just like you test your business continuity plan, or if you don't, you should be. There are several ways that you can test this, and again, it can be somewhat low tech. It can be done by a vendor. It can be done by you individually. attempt to access a device, attempt to log into one of your employees' computers just to make sure that the passwords are in place and that they're sufficient. Try multiple passwords on password-protected devices. See if the system flags it and catches you doing that. Look at the desk of your supervised persons. Make sure there's not a Post-it note under the keyboard that has all of their login credentials. That comes into that physical inspection. Attempt to access systems remotely. So, this can be from an unknown device or a known device. Make sure that it logs that access to the system. Make sure that your process catches that. If it's after hours or if it's from a different device. And then you need to document the results of your testing, and then use that as a guide to revise your policy as needed based on what your test discovered. And from there, once you've got the procedure in place, you tested it, you know how you're going to monitor it, you need to train your employees, make sure that they stay trained. Again, employees unknowingly pose the greatest risk of security to your firm. And so you want to eliminate that. This is probably, it's the greatest risk, but it's also about the easiest risk to mitigate. If you have employees that don't know what they're supposed to do, don't know how they're supposed to handle themselves, there's not a lot of recourse there. So all new employees, you train them up immediately, and then you conduct refresher training every year as policies change. Even if policies don't change, make sure that they're refreshed on that. And then it needs to be a cultural component of the firm. Again, if top management doesn't buy into this, and if top management doesn't follow the cybersecurity protocol, it's really hard to expect anyone else in the firm to participate in that as well. And so just make sure that you've got buy-in top to bottom on this, and you also need to document your training. Your insurance provider may require that you document that as well. And then up next, we'll talk about some general best practices and kind of what this should look like. So never click on links or download suspicious attachments. Don't open emails from unknown senders. Make sure that your antivirus is installed, active, and up to date. Keep your operating system up to date. Put in the security patches to any software that you're using. Set your PCs to automatically lock when it's not in use. Have a fairly short time window there. You should always shut down your system at the end of the day before leaving work. You need to confirm all third-party requests verbally. So you get that email that says, "Hey, wire me $100,000 to the following account." Make sure that is in place and active, and that you're able to verify that information there. And then always make sure that your client file has been uploaded to the proper folder. You don't want a situation where you have client data that's going to the wrong client because you put it in the wrong folder. Some other issues here, best practices is use alphanumeric passwords. Make sure you use strong passwords. Two-factor authentication, whenever possible, is definitely a thing that you should do. It just adds another layer of security, and again, it's not guaranteeing security, but it's going to take you down the road of being a far more secure firm. And then don't share personal information on public social media sites, date of birth, mother's maiden name, all those kind of things that are used as security questions somewhere. Don't use those on your social media. Don't put those out there, because that's going to allow someone access to it. And then don't access the firm system via unsecured internet connections. We talked about that already a little bit. Make sure that you're staying on top of that, and every time you access that data, you're giving an opening. You're opening the door just a little bit each time for malicious intent to find their way in. And now we'll kind of wrap it up a little bit with some exam and audit prep. Conduct a device inventory. This will be a part of your risk assessment as well. Know what devices have access to your firm network. Understand how your employees and your supervised persons are accessing the systems. Be prepared when you have an exam to answer questions related to outside consultation or IT or cybersecurity consultants that you use. You need to understand your firm's anti-malware software. How often are updates performed? How often are scans done? Why did you choose the software that you chose? Be able to explain those sort of things, and that kind of comes back to your due diligence on the software. Understand your policy on passwords and encryption. Be prepared to answer questions there. Discuss your cybersecurity policies and procedures. And then if you've experienced a cybersecurity incident, be sure that you've conducted a thorough risk assessment after that. Just like when you have a breach of your policies and procedures, if you have a breach of your cybersecurity, that's an excellent opportunity to take a step back and look at what could have been done to prevent that. What maybe could you have done differently to prevent that in the future? And really use it as a learning tool and a learning opportunity and a teachable moment for those supervised persons of your firm. And in doing that, that's not to say that you'll never see any deficiencies in your cybersecurity after an exam or an audit by a regulator, but it's going to put you in a better place. It's going to help you be prepared for that, so that you're not searching for this information unnecessarily with the regulator there. As you'll notice here, we have not done the Regulators Corner, the Q&A session in this one like we normally do, simply because with cybersecurity, where there's not a specific regulation except for Colorado and Vermont, we've decided to remove that because we've discussed some of those regulatory issues that regulators are seeing kind of throughout the presentation today. So we'll jump over to the MyRA compliance review. And there's some key features that we wanted to mention: the filing documents, MyRA registration, the compliance calendar, and then the record keeping and activity tracking. If you're not using MyRA compliance to its fullest, I would highly encourage you to use it definitely to its fullest. The compliance calendar is all new. The functionality has been expanded. I think you'll find it to be very useful for you. Next Wednesday, we will have a webinar specific to the new compliance calendar. So if you have questions about that, be sure to log in next Wednesday, 4:15 Eastern. You can register through the webinars link on MyRA Compliance, and you'll be able to gain some additional knowledge there. This month's checklist in the custom checklist section is on cybersecurity. And it's a walkthrough to help you kind of assess what your cybersecurity looks like and what your procedures are and what needs to maybe improve there. And it'll give you the opportunity to do that by going through that checklist. And as I mentioned, next week we will have a MyRA compliance tutorial webinar. It's going to go in depth on the compliance calendar this month to help you better understand the new features available there. And our blog this month, as I mentioned earlier, we have, as of October 17th, we've released a blog post on the cybersecurity checklist produced by NASA. That you can access the PDF of the checklist from that blog post. We also give you just a little bit of insight on that. We also have a post on the Investment Advisor Coordinated Examinations Report from 2017 from NASA. We also have a blog post on registering with the SEC as a multi-state investment advisor, and then we have a guest post, actually, from September 25th on how to keep your RIA firm up to date on new policies and rules. So I highly recommend checking out the blog. We put out a lot of content through there and provide a lot of information through the blog. So if you don't check that regularly, I would encourage you to do that. Just make that part of your regular practice, to go in and check out the blog, and even subscribe to that so that you get the emails when we update with new blog posts. As we wind down here on the webinar today, I appreciate you for sticking with me. I know it's a topic that's very complex, and again, it is incredibly dynamic. It's ever-changing. So if you have questions that maybe you haven't asked yet, I'll give you a heads up here to go ahead and get those questions in as we're winding down here. And go ahead and get those posted in that chat window on the GoToWebinar dashboard. This webinar, again, will be archived in the Compliance Webinars section of my RIA Compliance, and that's under Compliance 101. We definitely always welcome your comments and suggestions on future webinar topics. You can send those to sharkwick@riainabox.com. Next month's webinar, we look forward to seeing you there, will be November 15th, 2017 at 4:15 Eastern. Again, thank you all for sticking with me. I know this is a lengthy topic. It's a lengthy webinar, but I hope you took some good information away, and I look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.